So I think we should start, and feel free to continue eating. I am happy to introduce longtime friend and colleague Eric Rosenthal, who is the Executive Director of Disability Rights International, which when it was formed in the early 90s was actually called Mental Disability Rights International. And they dropped the M, so it's DRI. And fun fact about DRI is that actually in its early years it was located here at the law school for about 4 times?
Yeah, from 93 to 97.
Yeah, we shared some of the old, but when this was the new building, coming in here, and so that's, now the organization is downtown. Eric really, it's interesting to think about this organization over time. I was on its board for a long time. It really kind of created, in many ways, the field of international disability rights, that is human rights in a disability context. It seems now like such an established thing, but to think back at a time when there was no CRPD, when entities that did human rights work didn't see disability as a human rights issue. In fact, they would go into places, look for other human rights violations, and somehow miss that people with disabilities were part of that, whether it was orphanages or institutions for people with psychiatric disabilities, psychosocial disabilities. When you look at all the work that DRI has done over the many years, the incredible reports they've issued in countries like Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Romania, and really throughout the world, you could probably imagine they must have like 15 or 20 people, working around the world, and it's still, as a pretty small shop, which relies on both, Eric and the permanent folks who work there, as well as a group of people who volunteered, experts like Bob Oken, a psychiatrist in California, and others, who have gone on some of these missions and found some really horrific kinds of things. And I think, as you'll see from Eric's presentation, the combination of both documenting what's been seen, reporting on it, and then also working with groups in the countries themselves to try to sustain change. And so for those of you who are new or newer to this field, one of the important things is it's not easy to go into a country, write a report, and leave, but it's easier than sort of actually trying to work with folks in country to try to make change over time. So the report doesn't just take up space on the shelf, it actually has the possibility of exacting change. So Eric's a real hero in this field, and it's really terrific to have him here. And he will be co-teaching a course next semester with Janet Lord on global disability rights. So we're really pleased to have him.
Well, thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be back at the law school where it all started. I graduated actually from Georgetown in 1992, and the fact that this school was willing to open its doors and really help incubate a project into an organization in a completely unknown field, is really, what universities and particularly this law school does best. It was real innovation at the time. My background, I had in college studied mental health issues, was kind of dispirited with what I saw in the mental health system in the United States. I had a job, while I was applying to law school for a civil rights organization, then called the Mental Health Law Project, now known as the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Laws. It does impact litigation in the United States in the area of mental disabilities. They litigated some of the really most important deinstitutionalization cases in the United States, did work on rights of people in institutions as well as working for their full community integration. And so having had that background, when I went to law school, I was really shocked to find a gap in this area. And it was actually in a law school class, Juan Mendez, who now was here, and he was at the time an adjunct, he was at Human Rights Watch, and he was an adjunct professor at Georgetown. When we were going around the room in our seminar human rights class, and kind of each of us said a little background, and he heard that I had a mental health background, he tapped me on the shoulder and said, no one has done work on the human rights of people with mental health problems. And it would be great if you wrote your seminar paper for this law school class. And so, watch out, guys, what you write your seminar papers on, because it might turn into a career, as it did with me. I went to the library, And what I found there was really shocking to me. When you did a search on mental health and human rights, you came up with almost nothing. But what you did come up with was the information. This was 1990, 91. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The Soviet Union was still intact. But the only thing that there had been on mental health and human rights was the report about the placement of political dissidents in the Soviet Union in psychiatric hospitals. And when I went back to read those reports, it was an eerie experience, because the psychiatric facilities that they described sounded very much like the very facilities that we were fighting to close down in the United States. Probably a couple steps worse, but pretty bad places. 500-bed, 1,000-bed facilities where people were detained, where you could be determined to be mentally ill and locked up for life without due process, where once you were in an institution, you essentially couldn't get out. You were given no meaningful hope for return to the community, where you were given these horrible psychotropic medications that caused you to have a fuzzy brain, and you couldn't refuse medication, and some of the side effects were dangerous. And these were exactly the kinds of issues that civil rights activists in the United States have been fighting against, and yet in the international area, they were oblivious to the concept that people with mental disabilities, or disabilities at all, had protections under international human rights law. There was a perception that human rights were those core principles that that went above, essentially, domestic law. This is the kind of core idea of human rights, right? That no matter what the domestic laws of a country say, these are the fundamental, most serious abuses for which you would hold governments accountable on the international stage. But there's a strong perception that matters of social policy, for example, are up to the domestic jurisdiction of a country. So who are we to tell them how to run their mental health system? If they have an outdated mental health system, if they have problems, not for us to say anything. And so the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports, U.S. State Department, World Psychiatric Association had all done reports on Soviet psychiatric hospitals describing these horrendous abuses, horrible conditions, and, well, the report was about one political dissident and how that person was improperly placed because they had spoken out against their government, and they weren't really mentally ill. They were just a dissident who was put in there improperly. And it was as if the other 1,000 people in the facility did not exist. I knew we were fighting against abuses against those kinds of people under civil rights law in the U.S., but the international community was oblivious to it. There was another report, fascinating report, that was done by Amnesty International in Romania. And in Romania, one of the practices that they found was the use of ECT. I've heard of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. If any of you have seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I've told the story enough times, and enough decades have now passed, that fewer and fewer people have actually, this was a seminal movie.
To my life.
Yeah, seminal movie that in the United States really transformed the field of mental disability rights. We'll do a show of hands. How many of you have seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest?
That's pretty good.
Okay, pretty good.
You're not fair.
All right, this is required movie seeing for anybody.
Great book, too.
Jack Nicholson plays in the movie. Absolutely amazing movie, but it's a psychiatric hospital in the United States in which they're putting down the psychiatric patients, and one of the things they give is electroshock treatment, which is a shock to the brain that causes a seizure, and is used in the United States as a treatment for depression. It's been highly controversial, but in fact, the medical types have won out, and it is now an accepted practice in the United States, even though it is disliked intensely by many activists. But in the United States, when it's used with anesthesia and muscle relaxants. So you get the shock, you lose consciousness, and it temporarily relieves the most severe forms of depression. It can unfortunately cause amnesia, which is a little problem. So there are all kinds of ethical issues associated with it. But the bottom line is, when you're under full anesthesia, you don't feel the pain. And yet, the amazing thing was that in Romania, Amnesty International found that they're using ECT without anesthesia. So the result is you feel the electricity before losing consciousness. And to put a person in detention and to give them electric shocks is kind of core to what we would call torture. And yet, Amnesty International's report interviewed the psychiatrists who were doing it, and they said, unlike those Soviet psychiatrists that are using psychiatry for political repression, in Romania, they really are doing their best to treat the patients. They believe this is a treatment for depression, and they intend no harm, and they just don't have the resources for anesthesia. So we consider, this is in this Amnesty report, this to be a serious ethical issue that the Medical Association should consider, but it never says that this is a human rights violation, much less torture, in this report. And so there I was reading these, and I just like my eyes popping out, and amazed that under international human rights law there was nothing. There was no disability treaty at the time. So I wrote my seminar paper about why the protection against inhuman and degrading treatment or torture should ban such practices, why abuses in institutions might rise to the level of inhuman and degrading treatment or torture, why arbitrary detention protections that existed, say, under the European Convention, the American Convention, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It was interesting that at the time, Juan Mendez advised me. He said, look, when you're in a completely new area of rights where people are going to be skeptical, be conservative. Don't touch those messy areas of economic and social rights. You know, those can come later. What you want to show is that the core areas of human rights, torture, arbitrary detention, those are the kinds of things that are being violated. And if the most core, if you can get recognition that those most core rights were being violated, then everything else will flow. So when I founded the organization, that's what we looked at. And we wanted to look at where the abuses were most extreme. And so we went to psychiatric hospitals. We originally started out at psychiatric hospitals. Over the last few decades, we've shifted much more towards orphanages, because we found vast populations of children placed in orphanages, and we found that orphanages turn out to be a gateway to lifetime institutionalization for large numbers of people. Orphanages themselves, if you put a child in an institution, it generates disability. If you weren't disabled when you got in there, if you're put in at a young age, it causes psychological damage that may be irreversible. If you put it at a slightly older age, it can cause, there are certain times in your life where you can chart, for every 1 month of placement in an institution, you lose 3 months of certain forms of intellectual development. So orphanages exist, and the irony is orphanages exist worldwide. There are 10 million children in orphanages, and many of them are supported by Western charities that think it's a really great idea. And so I started out very much looking at psychiatric facilities, have shifted on orphanages, and have brought this issue to public attention. We learned many lessons along the way. The first one, I think, as Bob pointed out, that it's not enough to just go in and do a report. You know, again, when I founded the organization, I was modeling myself after Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They go, they do a report, and then they move on. That's their strategy. And I figured, and in fact, when I founded the organization and I was at American University, I got a $20,000 fellowship to set up the organization. And if I didn't have free office space from this university, I have no idea what I would have done. Deeply grateful for the support. But I figured this was a temporary little fun use of a few years before when I went on to my real career. And I assumed at the time that if I could publicize and document this, that the mainstream human rights organizations would take up the issue, that we'd be able to demonstrate that through exposure you can bring about change. And boy, was I wrong. We were able to get fabulous press. And yet, what has proven true is that change in this area is really, really, really hard. If you're back to that political dissident in the country, and you're Amnesty International, and you find a political dissident in a psychiatric hospital, you write a report, you could embarrass a government, and the answer is easy. Open the door and let the political dissident walk free, right? If you've got 1,000 people with a diagnosis of psychiatric or intellectual disability, if you open the door and let the people walk free, and yet there's no forms of community support, you'll have what unfortunately happened in the United States when we closed our institutions too quickly. Many homeless, mentally ill people out on the streets. So there needs to be a transformation. The second piece that I learned is that it's not just about a government making a decision to create community services and close institutions, is that there needs to be a powerful force for change. And in the United States, if you look back at the history, I had worked for a civil rights organization. And it's easy as a lawyer to think that the lawyers are the core agents of change, and they're the ones who are making it all happen. And at a time and place, it was in fact lawyers who brought cases to the Supreme Court that recognized rights. But if you scroll back 10 or 20 years further, the changes could never have taken place if, number one, there hadn't been mental health professionals who said services really need to be in the community and not in institutions. Number two, activists, people with disabilities, family members who were pushing their own states for change. In a way, the legal changes were some of the last changes that took place. The social movements were what created the pressure for real reform. So, whereas I had really set up the organization with the thought that I could do investigations and expose abuses, we learned over time that you really had to go into a country and build support for change and support advocacy organizations in those countries. And the truth is, I've now been doing this, I've done it in more than 36 countries around the world. We've spun off 7 different independent organizations, many of whom are run by people with disabilities. We now have offices in Mexico, Serbia, Ukraine, and Republic of Georgia. We actually, our staff, if you include the field offices, is close to 20 people. Our Washington office is still minuscule. We have 5 people in Washington. I mean, the need out there is absolutely enormous. And we definitely do need to expand. But the world really has changed. And one of the critical factors, we were doing work in Mexico. Mexico was the first country that I ever visited, the place that most shocked me, where abuses were just unbelievably extreme. And I'm going to show you a little video from Mexico. The transformative moment in my career, and I believe for the movement as a whole, was when we were preparing the release of our Mexico report. We brought a reporter in from the New York Times Magazine, and that reporter brought with him one of the top documentary photographers in the country. And we had a 16-page spread in the New York Times Magazine about the abuses that we witnessed in the Mexican psychiatric facility. Then ABC News followed. ABC News shined its cameras in the face of the Mexican authorities and said, "What are you going to do about this?" And the Mexican authorities said, "We'll solve this problem in 6 months." And they then figured out that solving the problem in 6 months would be really complicated. So they did one other thing in 6 months. They went to the United Nations and they sponsored a new resolution to draft a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. You never quite know what the unintended consequences of the work that you're going to be doing. But I truly do believe it was the embarrassment. It was having the ABC News cameras in the faces of the government officials. They had to prove that they were going to do something and do it fast. And so when they realized they couldn't quite fix their system in 6 months, they did sponsor a resolution to draft a disability convention. The disability convention has really been transformative. Transformative in that, to my mind, and if you look back to the law review article that I wrote in college and law school, the rights were essentially there, but people with disabilities were not explicitly mentioned. Arbitrary detention, torture, discrimination, those core rights needed to be extended to people with disabilities. The Disability Convention made it explicit. There are some key innovations in the Disability Convention. I understand Bob has talked about Article 12 and legal capacity, which is really transformative. It's, you can say that, well, the anti-discrimination provision of the international law always protected that, but no one would have ever thought that it really is discriminatory to take away a person's legal capacity. And the whole idea of supportive decision-making that transforms your idea that people need to make decisions for themselves really is a new legal idea. The right to community integration, Article 19 of the Disability Convention, which says that people have a right to live in the community with choices equal to others. I can tell you in my practice, that issue, though very logical to people out of the disability rights movement, was one of the hardest ideas to get across, and still is one of the hardest ideas to get across in the human rights area. One of the first cases we started to do litigation in the inter-American system of human rights. We've brought cautionary measures cases in Paraguay and Guatemala. We've now brought a right to community integration case in Guatemala, and we're preparing and about to file another case in Mexico. But I can tell you, out of Guatemala and of Paraguay, when we went to the Commission and we said, in order to protect these rights, you need to explicitly say it's not enough to fix up these institutions. You have to get people into the community. The Inter-American Commission had no concept of what we were talking about. They were able to tell these governments, you've got to create life-saving protections. And what the governments did was they fixed up, they painted the walls, they provided better care. In Paraguay, we were able to use the international pressure to sit down and negotiate a settlement. And it really was a historic settlement, because what we said to the government of Paraguay is, it's not enough to paint the walls and fix up the institutions. You've got to get people out into the community. And Paraguay agreed to do that. They agreed to actually downsize their institution. We were able to get a 50% reduction in the institution from about 400 to 200 people. We were able to get them to triple their mental health budget and create community services. And people who once were detained in institutions that never thought could live in the community are now living in the community. The UN actually did a documentary on that. And I can show one of two documentaries now. I could show the Paraguay documentary that is pretty dramatic, showing people living in cages who ended up being integrated in the community. It's pretty powerful. But what the Article 19 did is it said it's not enough to just have clean institutions. The answer is that people with disabilities have a right to be part of society, just like everyone else, with the same choices as other people. I would say Article 12 and Article 19, for the work that I do, have been utterly transformative as a legal framework. Implementation of that legal framework is the big challenge. Because, sad to say, I've just come back from Mexico. 10 years after the drafting of this disability convention, 15 years after the release of that report, the truth of the matter is the abuses are just as extreme as they ever were. So we've had tremendous improvement in the legal recognition, and yet enforcement is terribly, terribly lacking. We've had many, many successes. We found countries, as in Turkey, where we found unmodified ECT. 10,000 people a year were being subjected to unmodified ECT without anesthesia in the Istanbul psychiatric facility. And as a result of exposing that, we were able to get that practice abolished. In Serbia, after we released a report on Serbia, and we set up an office and we pushed for change, the government adopted a no new admissions policy to institutions. The number of children in institutions has now gone down to 600 in Serbia, and they have the lowest rate of institutionalization in the region, and even lower rate of institutionalization than France and Belgium. So we've had tremendous success in many countries, but the challenges to enforcement are enormous. I think it would be valuable to pause, take a little look at one of the videos that we did. It was actually a video that we presented to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as part of a thematic hearing on the rights of people in institutions. I I think seeing is believing. It's important to just witness exactly how horrendous this is. And then we can chat for a little bit about the challenges to implementation, because that's really where it's at.
Members of the Commission, Government of Mexico, and fellow human rights and disability activists from Mexico, thank you for this opportunity to testify before the Commission on the human rights of children and adults with disabilities who are detained in Mexico's institutions. My organization, Disability Rights International, first investigated and reported on the rights of people with disabilities in Mexican institutions back in 2000. As a result of our finding of horrendous abuses in Mexican institutions, this Commission expressed concern in its annual report on Mexico in 2000 about Mexico's treatment of people with disabilities. We returned 10 years later. Mexico had ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and we formed a coalition with disability and human rights activists in Mexico to examine Mexico's compliance with the new convention and its protection of basic rights under the American Convention. The video that you will see today is a product of that investigation. I am sorry to say it is as if time has stood still. The horrendous human rights violations that we saw then are taking place today on a large scale. Mexico has failed to create the community-based services and support systems that would allow people with disabilities to be part of society. As a result, thousands of children and adults remain segregated in Mexico's psychiatric institutions, orphanages, social care homes, and other facilities. 10 years later, inhuman and degrading treatment, and yes, torture, is widespread. Children are at particular risk of institutionalization. The placement of a child with a disability is likely to be a life sentence to segregation from society. 5 years old? And how much of her day does she spend sitting in bed? So she's here all day, but they turn her around.
Yes, sometimes she sits when they are.
Within institutions, children and adults are tied down to beds or wheelchairs. After 10 years, we returned to institutions and found the same people rocking back and forth in inactivity, in the same rooms, in the same positions that we observed 10 years ago. We found some of the same individuals tied down who we had photographed 10 years earlier. The use of prolonged restraints constitutes nothing less than torture. Laws to protect against improper restraint have not been adopted. People can still be detained for life without an independent hearing. People can be stripped of their right to legal capacity in violation of CRPD Article 12. This makes it impossible for victims of abuse to seek justice in violation of Articles 8 and 25 of the American Convention.
Let's see something like hell.
You're the director here and you describe it as hell?
You are going to see. I'm not lying.
People who look this dysfunctional really were not this dysfunctional when they came. Life in the institution has led to a deterioration. Moreover, even the people that you see here after years of institutionalization could be helped. I think the vast majority could survive with a lot of one-to-one attention in the community. There's no amount of poverty in Mexico that could explain 2 staff members trying to take care of 37 clients. There's no poverty that could explain this degree of abandonment.
The Mexican authorities will tell you they are fixing up the crumbling institutions you see in this video. The fact that they have money to fix buildings shows that they have money to create community services. To use that money to fix up psychiatric hospitals perpetuates the problem of segregation from society.
In the absence of oversight or any system of registering people in institutions, children and adults have literally disappeared into institution. Our report is dedicated to the memory of Ilse Michelle Martinez, a girl admitted to an institution at the age of 6. when her grandmother, Ardelia, came to find the young girl, she had disappeared. Local authorities found that she had been in a home that was used as a front for traffickers. Girls found in that home had been sexually violated, but Ilse Michel was never found. We found numerous other institutions where people were literally detained off the public record, some working essentially as slave labor, with no compensation or no recognition by any authority or outside awareness that they were living their lives detained in these facilities. Article 19 of the CRPD recognizes the right of every person with a disability to live in the community with choices equal to others. We ask this Commission to recognize that the segregation from society in violation of Article 19 also constitutes discrimination under the American Convention. We call on this Commission to investigate for itself, to conduct a visit to institutions in Mexico, to see for themselves the inhuman and degrading treatment and torture, and the ways people are systematically stripped of their rights. And we call on Mexico to provide full protection of the American Convention for people with disabilities and to integrate them fully into society. Thank you.
One very encouraging thing is the case of that girl, Ilse Michel, that was described. Well, after a publicity campaign, she was found, and turns out there had been an evangelical order, and it's never been clear to me, the authorities have prosecuted them, whether whether it really was an evangelical order, whether they were just a cover for traffickers, or whether they really did believe it. But according to Ilse Michel, she was taken out of the institution and placed in someone's family to be raised as a proper Christian. And then, at age 11, after this publicity came out, the family put her in a taxi and sent her back to the children's authorities. Her version is no one ever did anything wrong, and that it was just well-meaning Christians who were trying to raise her as a proper Christian. I believe that she was probably so scared and intimidated and told that she'd be killed if she spoke out about what really happened, that she's probably not really telling the full story. But public television, PBS, just did a documentary that's going to be airing. It's posted on our website, and looks at the issue of trafficking from institutions, and we actually interviewed Ilse Michel. So for her, it did have a positive ending. She's one of very few people trafficked out of an institution. We recently released a report from Ukraine where there are 200,000 children in orphanages. And the orphanages are pipelined directly into the sex trafficking industry. When children have very visible disabilities, age out of the orphanages. If you have a visible disability, you're put into a lifetime institution. But if you have no visible disabilities, the invisible disabilities that you face, one study showed that 1 in 10 orphanage graduates from Russia commit suicide after they're released from the facility. And many others for whom they have no family, no experience living in the community, no friends, end up being sucked into the sex industry. I can tell you about a couple of the more recent reports, but why don't we pause here. If you have any questions or thoughts from the video or from my presentation. Any questions? Yes.
What year was all this reporting on Mexico done and the push for the...
We've actually written 5 reports on Mexico. The first one we did came out in January 2000. And January 2000 is when the New York Times and the ABC News pieces came out, and later in that year when Mexico brought the resolution to the UN. Since then, we've done 4 other reports, and I'll tell you about some of the more recent reports afterwards.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What has been the response of Mexico now in 2010?
Yeah.
That they have done absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And another comment I have been to Mexico City like 2 or 3 times this year, and amazing how you don't see people with disabilities in the
On the
streets.
streets, yeah.
You absolutely don't see it. It's not they do not have people with disability in Mexico. It's they are absolutely recruited, and I didn't know they were this bad, really.
Well, the truth is, in the area of physical disabilities, I'm woefully, that's not an area that we focused on. But I can tell you, as a result of this report, the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities issued a damning report. So Mexico was one of the first countries to ratify the Disability Convention. And so it had to submit a report to the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities that reviewed their record. Their record, from top to bottom, from physical access to institutions, was terrible. But, among other things, they said specifically they failed to implement Article 19, that they have not created alternatives to institutions. And there's one particular case that we brought to the UN's attention, and that's the case that we're working on now. As part of our update report, we found a place called Casa Esperanza. It was a 37-bed facility. We were doing a report on sterilization of women, and I have copies of that report on the side. You're welcome to take it. The report on sterilization of women found that 1 in 4 women with psychosocial disabilities in our survey, we surveyed 100 women who were not inpatients, they were outpatients. 1 in 4 had been sterilized without their knowledge or consent. 25%. Unbelievable. Those were outpatients. We also found facilities such as Casa Esperanza where they systematically, as a matter of policy, told us all women are sterilized. And we asked, why do you sterilize all these women? And the director's answer, and we caught this on videotape, was, well, we really, there are men and women in the facility. We make sure the patients don't have sex, but we can't protect the women against, sometimes there's a worker from the outside who comes through, who knows what they're going to do, and they might violate them. So he admitted on camera that they were not protecting the women from being sexually abused. We found people locked in cages. We found people tied down. We were told that many of the patients, although we weren't allowed to see them, were bedridden and could never get out of bed. So what we did was we filed an urgent appeal to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and to the UN Rapporteur on Disability, and to the Mexico City Human Rights Commission. And when we reported to the UN, we actually reported on this case of Casa Esperanza, saying this was an extremely abusive facility where women were being sterilized. So in June of 2014, we discovered this facility, and by October of 2014, the United Nations had issued a report damning Mexico's entire mental health system. But in a very rare case, the UN mentioned Casa Esperanza by name and said, stop sterilizing women in this facility and end these horrible abuses. We went back in May of 2015. And amazingly enough, not only had nothing been done throughout the mental health system in general, but Casa Esperanza was fully up and functioning. And they hadn't even stopped the abuses at this facility. We got the Mexico City Human Rights Commission to help us with access, and we were planning to take a case against Casa Esperanza. Interestingly enough, the Mexico City Human Rights Commission went in immediately to close down this facility, which, from our viewpoint, you can't close down a facility overnight unless you create humane, safe alternatives for its residents. And we asked that the director of the facility be prosecuted for abuse, but that the people be kept in the facility till alternatives could be created. The Mexican Human Rights Commission moved so quickly that what they did was they took the 37 residents and they dumped them into other facilities, that many of whom were equally as abusive. So under kind of acting as if they were helping us out to end this place, they took these 37 people and spread them throughout all of Mexico. we've basically come to believe that the Human Rights Commission in Mexico was protecting the government and trying to make it harder for. In fact, they've threatened us. We met with some of the women who were survivors and asked them to seek legal representation. And the Mexico City Human Rights Commission last week threatened to take legal action against us for trying to tape record a conversation with one of the patients to see if we could legally represent them in a case, saying that because they didn't have legal capacity to consent, that they could take action again. I mean, it's like the depth of lack of understanding. And to my mind, I believe, and have no proof of this, that there is probably more than lack of understanding, but probably some kind of official corruption. Because we found that at least 5 women in this facility had been systematically raped over a 10-year period of time. And it could have been essentially that they were being trafficked for sex out of this facility. And the authorities knew about it and did nothing to stop it. So what has Mexico done beyond nothing? And so that's why we're working on filing another case in Mexico to take to the Inter-American Commission. But Mexico is just heartbreaking. As a human rights activist, there's a lot that I have over 20 years to feel proud of. Mexico is not one of them. They have resisted change in absolutely every way possible. Really, really gives you a sense of the enormity of the challenges.
What was the name of that politician? Was it Virginia sometime?
Yes.
Seemed to be an ally.
There was an ally we had early on in the process who got a government job to run their mental health system and then ceased to be an ally and went and started to defend the system. So, don't want to get you depressed, but those are some of the challenges. Other questions people may have?
Do you ever hand up? Oh, okay. So I'm a Latina,
Yep.
and I understand that each community, each racial community, or each country kind of deals with their mentally ill in a different way.
Yeah.
And you discussed community alternatives and kind of putting in a system into the community. What work have you guys done, or have you seen any changes between 2000 and 2010 in the way the community feels in Mexico or in any of these countries about their disabled population?
Well, one of the good things that we have done in Mexico is that we created an organization called the Colectivo Chucan, which is an organization made up of former psychiatric detainees. People who've had a diagnosis of mental illness, who've been locked up in institutions, and they now run their own peer support program. They both do human rights advocacy, and they essentially help each other stay out of institutions. In fact, what's amazing is that report that we have on there where we documented the sterilization of women. We actually trained members of the Colectivo Chucan to do the investigation. And what we find is that former psychiatric detainees are actually the best people around to do human rights investigations, because particularly on an issue such as sterilization, people will be hesitant. If I stroll into the room and ask a woman if she's been sterilized, she's not going to really want to talk to me. Whereas if we get former people who have some cultural similarities and who've been through some of the same abuses to talk to them, we've been able to get much more information. To speak to your broader issue about culture, when I was in college, I studied anthropology. And I remember I did some work on mental health and understood how mental illness itself is a social construct and is understood in very different societies in different ways. If God speaks to you in one context, you can just be considered a deeply religious person. And if God speaks to you in another context, you can be diagnosed with mental illness. So I am very aware of those differences. And when I set out to do this work, my expectation was that these issues would be enormously different all around the world. And it is certainly true that in every country that I've ever visited, there is resistance to community integration, there is fear of mental illness, there is in some societies, they don't even refer to it as mental illness. It is perceived in many different ways, and yet the discrimination and abuse that we've run across is universal. The resistance, and no matter how it's viewed, you're able in someone's living room to find a group of activists who are fighting the system and who are desperate to live in the community. Whatever the cultural differences are, I've never run across a society in which people with a diagnosis want to be locked up, want to have their rights taken away from them to make choices about their lives. Those desires for control and empowerment are universal. Family members of kids with intellectual disabilities. I've been in the Middle East, in Latin America, Eastern Europe, even a limited amount in Asia, and most parents who have a kid with a disability love that child and do not want to give up that child to an institution. What we found is most institutionalization happens not because the parents don't want them, but because the parents are under so much economic pressure and they face so much discrimination that they feel forced to do so. Yes?
Yes. Hi, this is Rashmi from Nepal, and the situation, the horrendous situation that you saw in video, it's similar in my country.
Yeah.
It's no different. And I was thinking about the relationship between poverty and the stigma and discrimination that the people are facing. How is the situation in the United States different from the Mexico, being these two are different countries in terms of economy?
Ultimately, when you boil them down, what we have gone through in the United States is exactly like what we experienced in Mexico. There was a time in the United States when people with disabilities were locked up, put away in long-term segregated facilities, and we've gone through a transformation. In the 1950s, there were 500,000 people in institutions in the United States. We've brought that down to below 50,000, probably even below that. So we've had what has actually been a fabulously successful deinstitutionalization process. It's far from complete. There are many people still locked up in institutions who shouldn't be there, and they're only there because of the lack of community services. But as a proportion of the population, it's gone down. So the challenges they face are essentially the same that we faced. There are circumstances where, in the United States, when we wanted to integrate people into the community, the citizens rose up and, put burning effigies on people's lawns to stop people with mental disabilities from living in their neighborhood. So we've had to fight discrimination and stigma in the United States very much. Hate crimes still exist against people with disabilities. We did a case in Massachusetts where they're in fact still giving electric shock to kids with autism as a cure for their behavior. We did a complaint against them to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and we're able to get the practice in Massachusetts stopped for new admissions, but it's still going on for the people who are grandfathered in. So, in my experience, the worst and most horrendous abuses that I've seen outside of the United States also take place in the United States at the same time as there has been tremendous progress. And so I think we have a lot to learn around the world from the progress that's made in the United States and many other countries that have gone through reform.
I think the other thing is that because some of our movements precede some of what's going on now in terms of getting people into the community, in the U.S., we went through certain stages that I think countries now can skip. So from large institutions, we went to pretty large group homes in many cases that were 15-person group homes, which nobody really would think of as a kind of family-style home. And then those got smaller and got smaller still and with different kind of support. So I think when internationally, when you go to places, one thing you say to folks is, A, we do see the same things here and certainly have seen them until relatively recently. And B, you can learn from our experience and skip some of those steps that we actually concluded were not really the right way and go directly to some of the more appropriate kinds of services.
They can do reform faster than we did by learning from our mistakes. Yes?
Kind of just to add to that and to go back to your point about orphanages,
Two questions. So one on the orphanage front, were you just saying orphanages in general, or orphanages that house individuals with disabilities?
Our view is that all orphanages are dangerous, with or without disabilities. Children without disabilities who are put in orphanages are at risk of acquiring disabilities. And studies have essentially shown that you can't make a good orphanage. You can clean them up, you can make them better. There are more humane and less humane orphanages. But in the end, whether you have a disability or not, every child needs a human being in their life to love and to form long-term attachments to. So families are a universal. And so orphanage placement is to my mind, a human rights violation, no matter what. And so part of the tragedy is the international funding of orphanages. Nepal is a really interesting example. Many years ago in Nepal, there were 3 orphanages, and now there's been an enormous influx of funding, and a lot of tourists. The new industry, what's called voluntourism. People go, they want to volunteer, they want to see a child with a disability, and they make small payments to be able to volunteer in an orphanage. The small payments that volunteers make have created enough of an incentive that you could call it, in a sense, trafficking, because there's now a demand for children, and so poor families place children in orphanages because they get a small payment. And in Nepal, there are now more than 500 orphanages that are as a direct result of the foreign investment and the volunteers. It's a real serious problem.
Okay. Yeah, because I worked in an orphanage in Bolivia for 3 years, so I was...
In what country?
In Bolivia.
Oh, yeah?
All those. And so I'm just trying to figure out, I'm thinking about the alternative that you had mentioned,
right.
But I'm thinking about a country, I mean, a lot of these countries are very poor, they don't have capacity, the government may not have it, may not really care.
Yep.
I mean, the money the orphanage got was not even enough for food for all of the 45 girls that were there. So I don't know, and a lot of them were there because they were abused at home, and they have a lot of risk at home.
Sure.
So how do you, I guess, deal with all of those types? They can't be at home, and they don't have the capacity to have these kind of group home things, which I also worked in the United States. So I've seen the difference, but like how, I guess I'm trying to figure out like how do you really remedy that, or how do you navigate that?
Well, it's something that you have to do. Every single one of those children in Bolivia has the same need for a family as everyone else. So the question is, how can the government? They may not have group homes now, but they need to create them. It is incredible how easy it is to label the parents as bad parents, and yet in many situations where they came from an abusive home, well, was there an extended family member? Was there a grandmother? Was there a grandfather? In the case of Ilse Michel that we saw in the video, there was domestic violence in the home. But we met the grandmother, and the grandmother knocked on the doors of the authorities and said, I want to take this child. So if there's an abusive mom, there's probably a grandmother or a cousin or a sister or a brother. And so if the governments commit themselves to trying to deal with a broader network of kinship care, in developing countries with few resources, you also very often have stronger, more extended families. And so an effort needs to be made to keep them within those families. For children with very severe disabilities, it may be that in fact a family can't cope with the disability in their home. But no matter how severe the disability, there's no reason that that support can't be provided in a community context rather than an institution. Odds are, if a child has a really severe disability, just putting them in an orphanage is not going to treat their disability. They can get no care in an institution or no care in a home, and if you're going to get no care, you might as well be at home, right? So that's why we believe that in no circumstances should any child be placed in an orphanage. The transformation can't necessarily be done overnight. There is a process that you have to work towards, but we believe the priority is to declare a moratorium on any new placements, because the truth is 95% of kids in orphanages are not orphans. They come from families, and the families just don't have the resources to keep them. And so before the family bonds break up, the priority is to go work with those families to make sure that they can keep them. And when you can close the door to orphanage placement, then you can ultimately solve the problem of orphanages over time.
In line with the same topic, in Nepal, there are many women who are actually running orphanages, and they were actually awarded CNN Hero Award to Samakmani last year, and one of them is nominated this year. This year, she's doing wonderful. She's from here, New Jersey.
She's from New Jersey?
Yes,
you know her?
Yes, I know her.
And what is she doing?
She actually adopted many children who were orphans because of the insurgency. Their parents were killed. One of their parents were killed. So she adopted them and she started a school. It is kind of orphanage.
Yeah, so is she helping them stay in their families? I mean, the question is why...
No, she's taking them with her.
But wouldn't they be better if she helped them stay in their families?
I think when you are, I don't know the internal scenario, but then when I'm seeing from outside, it seems like the children are really enjoying. They're becoming part of this modern world. They are learning English. Right. They're learning Nepali. They are studying there. Yeah. It's wonderful to see them.
Yeah, I will tell you, I'm extremely skeptical of the whole CNN Heroes program and this program in particular. Yeah. There is no doubt you can walk into many an orphanage and see happy, smiling, singing children and think that this is a good solution. And yet, programs that separate kids from their families can have damage that can be much harder to see. And that rather than giving people an award who help the kids not live in the families, we'd like to see awards go to programs, and there are programs that help people stay in their families. I would love, and I'm going to give you my card, if you could help us reach out to that person, because we're about to go to Nepal. And I would really like to take a closer look at what is going on. And I really appreciate it if you happen to have the contact.
Thank you very much.
Really valuable.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I think that having this discussion about orphanages, it touches on so many other things that is not just disability rights. It touches on women's rights, access to birth control, access to family planning.
Absolutely.
It touches on international adoption. I just recently watched Stuck. It's a documentary about the barriers that people face when they're trying to adopt a child internationally. If you've ever had a family member go through that, it takes more than a year, at least, and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And sometimes even 2 years later, then somehow the kid, phases out of the program, or they just don't get the child. And I think that in that sense, I would prefer to have a child in a home than in an orphanage for 2 years, or for how many years they've been in there. And I think that it touches on so many different issues.
You are absolutely right. It does touch on so many issues, and these are complicated. I don't mean to demean the people who are really trying to do good work, and there are many volunteers and people who really are saving lives. And yet, the question is, if you have a human rights framework and you take your resources and work towards community integration, can we do it better? And I believe we can. I mean, the issue of international adoption, of my board members, the majority of my board members have adopted internationally. And I can look at those children and know that they've helped save the lives of those children. So I am not going to, with no hesitation, say that what they did for those individuals was a good thing. But we also know that in the international adoption area, the fees that you pay in order to get that kid end up supporting the orphanage systems. And the orphanages are feeders for international adoption. And so you can save a few individuals' lives by plucking them out, but the kids who are left behind may be far worse off. And that the international adoption movement as a whole is one of the things reinforcing the orphanage problem. There are many people who oppose international adoptions for that reason. I do not oppose international adoption. Anytime you're saving someone's life, more power to you. But we've got to be very, very careful about not funding those segregated services and working to end that.
Well, congratulations on all that you've done, especially as a Georgetown grad. I'm so happy to know that another Georgetown grad has done so much wonderful things. Just curious, where does most of your funding come from?
Not enough sources, as Bob can tell. It's always a race to try to keep this funded. So We have terrible, terrible problems. Most of our money comes from private foundations. We have about 10 to 20% from individual donors. We have one U.S. government grant right now, and hopefully closing in on another one. Any organization that stands up and embarrasses governments as we do, getting corporate funding and even getting U.S. government funding is a challenge, because there are many mainstream human rights groups that won't take government funding to be able to preserve their independence, to be able to document rights. So we've always taken our mission to document abuses more seriously than we've taken our fundraising. So we are very pure and very underfunded. But that's the reality that we face. So I will be teaching a course this spring. I would encourage any of you who are around to sign up, a global disability law course. We are currently doing litigation in the inter-American system. We're documenting abuses. We're always looking for interns, both in our Washington office and in our field offices, Mexico, Serbia, Ukraine, and Georgia. So please be in touch if any of you are looking for interesting experiences and want to lend a hand.
Eric, I want to thank you for